Well, welcome everybody to this session, and thanks very much for your time this afternoon. This roundtable is about ODI's mission, really, which is to create a world where data works for everyone. We need trustworthy data to flow in well-governed ways around the data ecosystem. Data use is restricted when governments and organizations are unable to assess the trustworthiness of data sets or the data practices of an organization. But when data and organizations in the data ecosystem are trusted and trustworthy, we see an increase in data flow, which leads to an increase in value in the form of products, services, analyses and insights, and created from the data, and better decisions by the governments or organizations used in that data. So we're here to talk about the best ways for an organization to instill good data practice and to assure those collecting, using and sharing data that they can trust it. So to help me with that question, I just want to introduce our panelists here. First of all, Susanne, Erkens-Reck, General Manager of Roche, Austria. Susanne has 20 years pharmaceutical industry experience. In her extensive career at Roche, she has been global leader in IT and group functions, moving Roche's group processes to modern cloud solutions, shaping flexible working, agile leadership, and designing an inspiring and inclusive work environment. As of 2020, Susanne leads Roche in Austria after holding global CIO positions for over 10 years. So uniquely combines digital and healthcare leadership. So welcome, Susanne. We're joined also by Christian Witt, Dr. Christian Witt, sorry. Dr. Christian Witt is a Senior Program Officer in the Agricultural Development Team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He provides strategic direction on innovation in soil health and agronomy as part of the Digital Farmer Services portfolio. Prior to joining the foundation, he was a scientist and project manager in international agricultural research with 17+ years of experience in plant nutrition and soil nutrient management in the tropics. And welcome, Christian. And then joining us from Manchester, Caroline Bellamy. Caroline is the Director and Chief Data Officer of the UK Ministry of Defence. So Caroline joined the UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD as we know it here, in May 2020 as their first Chief Data Officer when the Defence Data Office was established. Caroline is leading the Defence Data Strategy and Data Transformation Programme to underpin the realisation of data as a strategic asset for defence. So prior to joining the MOD, Caroline had a 30-year career in the data industry across FTSE 100 and public sector. And Caroline is experienced in executing major data transformations and champions data at board level. So, well, thanks for joining me. Great panel, great experience. And kind of the first question I wanted to ask about data practice. What do we mean by good data practice? I'm going to ask Susanne, since you were the first to join us today. So what do we mean by good data practice? What does that mean in your organization?
Good data practices means actually fair data principles. It means that data is available in order to make the right healthcare decisions. So good health data means health data for the individual, for society, and for the research-based companies and academics in order to find the best medical treatments for the future for each patient.
Very succinct. Caroline?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks, Ed. Good afternoon, all. Really good to be on the panel. What does that mean for me? The most important things it means for me is making sure that the data is fit for the point of relevance and use. Not all data is relevant for all use and in all places. And that's particularly brought to my mind in the current construct and environment I'm in that we do have regulatory, legal, ethical restrictions and consents over data, and that's wholly right and appropriate. And for me, it's about making transparent what data you have, what you can use for what purpose, and making that clear and accessible so that the right data is used for the right purpose, for the right outcome, in the right way. And if you cover and are covert about your data, then it's very difficult, and users will tend to scrape and take and hunt and find and do the things that we don't want them to do, kind of sub the table and on little cottage industries. So for me, it's making the data fit for the point of relevance and purpose.
Yeah, for whatever business or organization. Christian, do you have a view?
Well, we asked ourselves that question 4 or 5 years ago, and I think it is easy to come up with a definition of what good data practice means, sort of in the global hemisphere of agriculture, but that doesn't help me, what I should be doing Monday morning. So that was where we were in 2018. Mm-hmm. We had worked with Godan. We had taken a hard look at what does it mean as a funder to actually look at good practice around data and data sharing and data assets as part of our investment making. And we teamed up with USAID and DFID in those days, now FCDO, to come up with a clear a path on how we could be doing better. But it resulted in a good, high level intentional ask, but it didn't change what I do. Really, as a program officer who is dealing, for example, with soil data. And so we started unpacking and questioning, our partners, or rather sitting down with them and going through, what's the bottleneck around actually, connecting where data are generated to where data are used. And it was a myriad of issues that had to be dealt with and resulted in the end of the day in a toolbox, a data sharing toolkit, and that's where you can find it, datasharingtoolkit.org, which had, 7 key modules that one would need to step through. And you need to realize that in agriculture, we are probably a good decade behind other sectors when it comes to good data practice. So to us, that was a first stepping stone, identifying the key personas that need to be involved in a given country, and walking through and building trust, first of all, among those who generate data and those who need data, and how to actually get data liquidity going before you can even think about, do you trust the data? Yeah. So we are at a very different entry point. Yeah.
So there's a foundation that needs to happen before you get to that consideration. But it's interesting you made the point about the different sectors. I mean, Susanne, Caroline, do you have a view on how different practices are appropriate for different sectors?
Yeah, definitely. I think the pandemic has shown all of us how scattered actually the data in the healthcare sector is. Did we have easily available all the data about high-risk patient groups? Did we have easily available the data of, how our healthcare system was able to cope with the fight against the pandemic? And the response of the different European member states was quite different because actually each country has scattered islands. So it's not a surprise to now see the European Commission in their data strategy take the health data space as the first data space that they want to build. And this EHDS, European Health Data Space, it's really interesting. I think all EU member states need to feed into it in order to really take a significant step. And this is a pivotal time where we need and can modernize the policy framework for health across the whole continent, basically, in a really ambitious way. And I think what is interesting is that the public opinion, citizens have realized that it helps them individually to get the best treatment. It helps society as a public environment to better respond to healthcare crisis or healthcare overall treatment of the public, as well as to macroeconomics. for the overall healthcare system to develop into the right future and to invest and to be strong in the areas with the infrastructure and capacities where they are needed. But all of this needs to be fueled by data, which today isn't always available in a joint infrastructure. Take the example of healthcare records. Not even all countries have electronic healthcare records, no. Just as one example.
Very good, very good. So we'll come back to the public consent and the trust required for public consent. That's a really good point. Caroline, from your experience, you've worked in a number of different sectors, but you're now kind of government sector. How is that different?
So if I sort of build and add to the points that both Susanne and Christian are making, I think what's really important is what Christian talked about, is the fundamentals and the foundations. And I think one of the things that's really important is that the data profession, which doesn't really exist formally yet, in government sector, for example, with a second D and a DDAP, but it underpins analytics and data science and information and intelligence and all sorts of things, is what are the fundamental and foundation elements of good data practice and capability? That's where you kicked us off with. And actually those things are really common across industry and across sector and into government. So the tool bag and toolkits that Christian kind of refers to, I use the same common principles and same approaches to how to form data capabilities, data office, data skill sets in industry as I would do in government. Now might deploy them differently. You might have different legal and policy and regulatory frameworks, but actually, do you need data catalogs and data reference sets and core data registers in industry and in government? Yes, you do. Do you need metadata practice in industry and in government? Yes, you do. Do you need common skill sets and frameworks? Yes, you do. It's about how the profession, and it's one of the reasons that I joined the public sector, was to bring the profession of good data capability into a broader context. I think the challenge and the opportunity for us through fora like this and with our communities is to unite around this profession and to have a common approach and a common coherence, and to leverage and to swipe with pride where industry is doing something good, let government leverage that, and to think about those things and drive the value of our data. So it isn't something that's sort of seen as exploited in the private sector and precious in the public sector. As Susanne talked about, the public is really seeing the value of its information generated out of its data, really adding value to citizen, to society. Getting good digital services is only possible if the data that flows through those digital services is robust and accurate. So I think there are common principles, there are common approaches, regardless of private and public sector. Obviously, there are differences in policy, in regulatory, and in ethic. So it's not like for like, but there are really common capabilities.
And there are elements. So I take the point, completely take the point. So it's about building that strong foundation. It's about a roadmap of going from where you are when you first appear in an organization, or starting to get those things organized, following the strategy to develop your kind of robust data foundation, and trust plays an element in all aspects of that. No, we'll come back to that. But the other thing I wanted to touch on was about sharing data and open data. I mean, is that something you need to build towards, or is that something that is holding you back, or is that something that can happen along each stage as well? Christian, can I ask you that question? Open and sharing data.
Yeah, so let's start with maybe a bit of context setting. I'm not talking about agriculture in general, because you can imagine that in highly integrated markets, that looks very different than in a smallholder setting where we're dealing with millions and millions of smallholders, each tilling only about a hectare of land, which is like the size of a football field, but then even parceled out in different parts of the farm. So what is key, from various actors' perspective, from the interest of a farmer, but also those servicing her, including government with enabling policies or private sector or anyone in between, is to have a fundamental understanding on the issues, the constraints, and the challenges, and like weather data, we are dealing with fundamental data sets, public goods, global public goods, national public goods that will require to be put in place. And the philosophy, if one data point is generated, you do not want to generate it a second time because it's costly and it means duplication and waste of effort. So think about, the fundamentals that maybe in the UK you take for granted, but it's not necessarily the case elsewhere. So key information layers like soil data, like your cropland data, where crops are grown, infrastructure, etc. So all the basic layers are not necessarily there yet, or digitized, or open, let's say, fair access. It doesn't necessarily have to be open, because there could be, personalized information. Think of soil data in a particular farm where farmers need to give consent. How do you organize that when you're dealing with millions of farmers, right? So there is a growing understanding, I think, in countries that basic data have great value if they are in the public space. So India, for example, has recognized that with spatial data, saying it doesn't make sense to hold back these data because they can be key enablers for our own government, but also those servicing small-scale producers. That needs to be in the public space. But the policies are at a very high level, and it's hard to say, what do I do Monday morning if I'm an individual in let's say, a research organization or as an institute? How do I implement? Yeah. So there's increasing recognition, but it takes a several-step process to get where we need to be. And then, even if you think globally, if you look at soil data, for example, in the US, freely available, paid for by public money. In the UK, you have to pay for it. And you can look at how many of the soil data, generated with public funding in the UK are broadly used versus the US. So it's not just an issue, in a country like Mozambique or elsewhere.
It's interesting that recognizing the value of data sometimes makes it more available and sometimes closes it off, doesn't it? In different circumstances. Caroline?
So from my point of view, I think I wholly agree that there are data sets, core reference data sets, that are extraordinarily valuable and of high importance, and that will vary by sector. But there are some data sets that are really common. So geospatial data sets, that is really imperative to be able to have access to geolocation. And increasingly that's becoming open and available. Even in Ministry of Defence, we use huge amounts of openly available data. One of the topics around data is it's not always the data set that you get that is important, it's how you put it together with other data sets. Yeah. And it's the data engineering capability around your constructs of data and how you make your data, and indeed how you support. We do lots of work with academia, for example, and the science community and the S&T community to unpack data sets. We do have data sets, for obvious reason, that have huge, security classification and controls around. But we also have data sets, and we access data sets that are very much in the open space. And increasingly, even sensitive work is done in the open space. Social media generates a tremendous amount of data that is openly accessible. I think one of the responsibilities of many organizations is to partner at a knowledge and a data engineering level to help people utilize what are often complex data sets. So Christian, talking about data sets that are difficult for new users, SMEs, startups, the public, smaller environments or economies to get access to, and how do we train people to get comfortable in different data set utilization? And I think that's a really important mission for all of us in the data community to get after. Certainly I can say from MOD, we both use open data, we access it, we share our own data, and we look at, and increasingly the subject is around metadata, not just the actual data itself. So I would take the topic to that level as we would mature. But yeah, really important topic area.
It's a really good point that when you're sharing data, you may not see the value of it without that being added to another data set somewhere else. But until those two organizations share the data, that value isn't realized. So you can't always see that in an individual use case applied to your own data set.
Just it is important, Ed. It's beholden upon me to be also transparent the other way around on the risk side. It is really important to understand the implications of putting data sets together and bearing in mind the ethical or legal or regulatory frameworks of just combining data. So I just wanted to respect there is always a converse to the upside. Which
that's a really good point about understanding the consequences of sharing data. Yeah, exactly. And Susanne, sharing health data, there must be a lot of, I know that Roche has been very sort of active in trying to share health data.
Yeah, definitely. We recently commissioned also ODI with some research work to look into each member state's regulatory environment, to which extent data sharing of health data and secondary use of health data and under which conditions that is possible in each state, because those will be the topics that overall the EU Commission will need to look into in order to build a European health data space. I really liked what Caroline mentioned in the beginning about this data profession. I fully agree. I think we will need more professionalism around building data sets, which structures, infrastructure, and institutions are going to be needed in a country, in a specific data space, and to have professionals, data experts who will help actually build that and maintain that. I loved how Christian then combined this notion of the professionals, of the data experts, together with the data standards and data infrastructure. I mean, often if you haven't defined, what is an apple and what is a pear, well, you can't start working with data across different institutions or across different parts of the country, and you will never be able to speak the same language, nor to draw meaningful conclusions. And that's, I think, very industry independent. So we need professionals, we need standards and infrastructure, but we also need, like Caroline mentioned, the regulatory, the legal frameworks, the ethical considerations to under which constraints, for which purposes can these standardized, highly professionally pulled together data sets be used, and for which purposes. And that is particularly important in an area like healthcare, where often today, still in conversations, people say, well, should we go with data privacy and safeguard the privacy rights, or should we use health data? Well, that's rubbish. Of course, we're in Europe. I mean, data privacy is a human right. So we want to have safe, secure, and privacy protecting ways how we can utilize health data to the benefit of the individual patient, as well as healthcare systems, as well as research of future medicines that will bring cure to diseases that today cannot be treated fine. But for this, even when we have the professionals, when we have the data and the data infrastructure, today sometimes we don't have the adequate policy and regulatory frameworks that allow individuals and companies to have a clear framework, what they can do, and so that they can invest and go into that space, because it's not going to be done as a hobby. This is heavy lifting, and it will require professionals to go into it.
Yeah, Christian?
Yeah, it's funny, when I was thinking of the session, I thought, I wonder what health, defense, and agriculture have in common. But when I listened to you, Susanne, if you just replace health with agriculture, it works, one by one. So just to maybe iterate on the issue that you mentioned around capacity within systems, I think one needs to be a little bit creative as well on, for example, how to work in coalitions, you know, in installing trust, for example, between public and private sector, and then, you know, take the step beyond the national boundary. So one example is we have been working with Digital Green in an organization that started off in India, sort of in agricultural advisory for small scale producers, and using a video based format. And they have, you know, gained a lot of credit with the government for, you know, being very aligned and transparent, but introducing technology basically where it was really hard to scale solutions. And in Ethiopia, they have started a similar effort, but here we worked with this consortium of public and service provider partners to say, well, everybody is generating ag content, but not sharing. So there's a lack of trust in, here's what you recommend, here's what I recommend. The government sort of was deeply concerned about that. So building a platform, a digital platform to share content in a peer review format. And then if you use these data, basically the moment you download them, you have a shared data agreement signed, basically, because that is another tricky part. How do you, I don't want to say Uberize, but I couldn't come up with a better metaphor at the moment. How do you take out the complexities of these engagement and build that trust into the system from day one, so you do not have to be a data expert to operate it? It has to be taken out of the equation often. Yes, you do need, I think, a very good, high quality, you know, data scientists in various organizations from public and private. And it is hard for the public sector actually to compete with the private sector for these people. But if you form these kind of partnerships across public and private, you might be able to get creative on how to solve for it. So I was just reminded of that example when I was listening to you, Susanne.
Agree.
Very good. So wanted to turn to the people side of things, and then perhaps we can look at some of the questions from the audience here. So the theme of the conference is people and data, and we talked about the competencies we need for basic data management, to use that term, and the higher levels of or different levels of data manipulation in data science. How do we? One of the things I'm interested in is how do you convince your organisation that to take data seriously, whether that's, and is it harder to convince the senior executives or the technicians and operations people? Susanne, you're laughing.
Well, at Roche, there's nobody I have to convince.
Yeah.
Look, Roche is celebrated. Roche celebrated its 125th anniversary as a company this year, and we are rooted in science. Our mission is to find better treatment options for patients in need, as well as innovative diagnosis, so that the treatment that the physician is deciding on is the best treatment for this person at this point in time. What we need to handle with that is data. Nobody in the world invests more in research and development of innovative medicine than Roche, which means we invest in data, because finding new treatment options means clinical studies. Clinical studies means data, comparing data of new treatment options to standard of care. And it's been our core business to handle data of people and to find out scientific hypotheses, whether they truly bring a benefit for patients or not, which is also an important scientific learning, which may end up in failed clinical trials, but in an increased insights for medicine. So We are the company that always used to handle data in order to get to better treatment options, to better medical research. And I think what is different now is that everybody else, also in the healthcare systems outside of clinical trials, is handling data digitally, which means real world data comes into play. So also in the health space, we have real world evidence, we have real world data. We can see how today's treatments are working. Let me give a small example. If one of your relatives hopes to get a new innovative treatment and signs up to a clinical trial, well, they do that because they hope they get the new medicine. They don't want to be on the comparison arm with the standard of care or the placebo. Now, imagine if the data in the clinical practice was as good and as, in terms of quality and standards, as reliable, so that the comparison arm could be the real world practice. Just imagine, then every patient who is signing up to a clinical trial could benefit from the innovative treatment, just as one example. In the pandemic, of course, we all lived through so many examples where using the data systematically could have fast forwarded us to a better place where maybe less drastic measures would have needed to be taken to protect healthcare systems around the world.
Very good. So it's the nature of your organization.
It's the nature. I mean, there is a lot we debate within Roche, but the value and the importance of data and the importance of handling it with high quality and high standards, that's in our DNA.
Very good, very good. And Caroline, is it the same with you? Maybe not in every organization you've worked in, I imagine.
Yeah, not in every organization. And it's been about maturity as well. I think a couple of things I would talk to, as this is around the people topic. I think there's no doubt that everybody wants the outcome. There are great phrases, data is an asset, we must exploit it. It drives advantage. And very much in the commercial sector or the private sector, it is about driving incremental value, incremental capability, increased efficiency, optimization, all of those good and great things that we know helps us make decisions, helps us deliver the right actions, helps us do understanding, and helps us do investigative analytics where the data tells the story. And we'll deploy new and modern techniques to do that. Machine learn, deep learn, AI, all of those, they're methods to apply and to deploy at the data and at the information. So everybody wants the outcome. That's kind of the easy bit. Sometimes I've certainly come into organizations where people just think it's a pink unicorn and we can write some data standards and we'll employ a CDO and suddenly we'll have the fabulous outcome. And I think Susanne talked earlier about there's hard yards to go to get data right. It is an asset just like any core asset in an organization. We have to take care of it. If I use the example of my current organization, we utilize a lot of data in all of those exploitation arena. So our decision-making, public policy, financial, HR records, vet records, we use data everywhere, and we use data in a military construct. We tend to use it in pockets, and increasingly, and what was evident also during COVID, is the interoperability of data to have integrated data sets and understanding was a multiplier of value. Now, there's hard yards to integrate data. We've talked about the ability to put data sets together, to understand how to use them, to understand where they are, who's got them, what are the legal and ethical, how we get after this is not something that AI just does. You've got to train algorithms, you've got to have capability. What's been hard in most organizations is identifying, certainly in immature organizations, let me put it that way, of what data professionals' skills and funding and enduring funding is required. Yeah. A lot of people like throwing money at a data project and a data initiative. What they don't like is persistent funding that curates the data as an ongoing asset. So Susanne, we have a chief scientific advisor. She is absolutely obsessed with the curation of data over time, because for S&T and for data, for the scientific community to leverage the asset of the data, the times there is the data has to be robust and accessible. That takes ongoing and enduring effort. So at MOD, actually, I'm delighted to say the door is open, much like Susanne has described at Roche, and at most organizations I've gone into, in fact, every organization. What's harder is when we then start to talk about, well, we need data skills, we need data training, we've got to do some rollout of skills and capability, we've got to look at the funding models, we've got to look at some data tooling. Sometimes the technology teams are some of the harder ones to convince because they kind of want to have the tech conversation first. And I'll say, let's maybe not ask us to build a data lake. Let's say, what do we want to do with data? And we'll work out how we might achieve that. But let's understand the outcome and let's understand how data plays into that. Then let's think about the technology implications. And that's certainly, I'm delighted to be in open arms in the MOD environment where data is actually part of the entire technology capability for pan defense, where it's now explicitly, not just covertly in the digital strategy, it's actually explicit that if you do good digital, it doesn't equal good data. You have to explicitly focus and fund the data. We're also addressing huge data training programs at all levels of leadership. So right through to our very senior, bless you, Susanne, senior through to ministers, right up at what we would call the most senior levels, where we're educating and training, literally giving them training courses, and looking then at the entry level into both military and the civilian parts of organization, so that data becomes a truly federated and consistent and persistent aspect of all training. It is part of core. It's as important as English and maths as it is. If you don't understand how to think about data, then you really aren't part of how we need to think about things. And that is embraced. But you have to think about all of those things.
Yeah, very good, very good. And does, I mean, Christian, please answer that question, but the additional point I've got is whether recognition of data as an asset or as more of an important factor these days, does that make the job more difficult, or does that make the job easier to get the train moving?
Well, first of all, you know, we start with partners in the field. We start with, you know, looking at a smallholder setting. What, you know, information does she need or does benefit her, and then working backwards and across the data value chain, if you like. And farmers make data-driven decisions. They might be qualitative data, but it's you know, every farmer experiments in the field, and so every farmer understands the value of these experiences, or data, if you wish. Yeah. So working backwards, there is then you know, consent around the importance of you know, data, putting the core data assets together that enable innovation and allow you know, progress towards an agricultural agenda, for example. So this is, you know, obviously for a data-driven organization like the Gates Foundation, you know, well recognized and embraced. The question is, how do you go about it? And there are, you know, it's not one. Well, I should, you know, hit the pause button here. There is one case where we have a foundation-wide policy, and that is on open data access and publications. I think that's probably where we're best known for our open data access policy in driving that, you know, paying for publications, for example, for our grantees, so everything is open access. But increasingly, you know, and that came up in individual programs. It came up in health, realizing we're funding a lot of clinical trials in that space, but we don't have one standard data agreement even across, you know, all the grantees in the health space. And our teams inside do a lot of, you know, data analysis, so needed access to these data. So within that program, they reprogrammed actually the way to go about data access, and they have employed a lot of data scientists. In agriculture, it was largely at the project level, but we realized that there are systemic bottlenecks that need to be addressed, you know, either, you know, in a subsector or at a national level, and we can't shy away from it. So we formed a working group within the foundation where, you know, you have from education, health, agriculture, you know, financial service for the poor. You have, you know, program office taking part, sharing learning, while still the entry points may be a bit, you know, different from program to program, but the issues are actually very similar. And then build it out from there. So it's a 2-3 year journey, I think, which we embarked on, that will, I think, allow us to understand better what the core entry points are. Do we need to maybe definitely move away from just project-based implementation? I think what you, Caroline, just talked about, you know, everybody's keen to do that, but the longer term vision is really hard to secure funding for or get buy-in from partners. So how do we go about that? But I do believe that with some, you know, learnings under, you know, under the belt, if you will, you know, around core data sets and what they enable, the data assets that you spoke about, is fundamentally important for the various stakeholders to work through a very specific example, learn from that. So in Ethiopia, for example, they have built a very progressive data policy around soil data and would like to expand it now to the whole agricultural sector. Yeah. So it just shows that you need to start somewhere very tangible if you want to change things
and build from that. So yeah, thanks very much, Christian. We're really running out of time, and I wanted to get some questions from the audience here. Thank you, Richard, for your 4 questions, but they kind of boil down to some of the things that I think we've already addressed, particularly in the healthcare side of things. But he has a question about data ownership within the organization, identifying the people who are responsible for, you know, whether you use the term data ownership or not, but the people in the organization responsible for that data set. Anybody got any comments about getting those people on board?
We certainly do. So we have we have a data governance and management team, an entire focus agenda on information asset owners, and in fact we challenge that quite regularly, because what was right, you know, a while ago may not be right now as well, and also data moves on and data's capability move on. So we have kind of live groups that are constantly looking at what's critical data, what is the ownership, stewardship, custodianship, how do we want to use data, and constantly checking and rechecking and rebalancing that. We're maturing in the space, but a conscious and consistent focus now on, and indeed I've rather challenged into the market with the latest MOD data strategy, in that we're talking really explicitly about our responsibility, not just with respect to the data we have accountability for or indeed own, but also to the data that we use and who is accountable for that, and the relationships and the trust boundaries right at the top of this conversation. So it's really important that you take responsibility for not only the data that you use and generate, but the data that you acquire, that you interoperate and you share. Because as Susanne talked about, data privacy, security, integrity, you know, in this cyber world is a really important topic, and we need to take that very, very seriously.
And the people in the organization understand those roles, Susanne?
Yeah, I think that's very essential. If you want to have your own shop in order, of course, internally you need to have these data specialists, clear data ownership, you know, clear data architectures and strategies. So fully agree. It's a great question. That is very important when you look into having your own, cleaning up your own house about your data. I think the more interesting and the bigger question is, how do you show up as a strategic partner to the overall ecosystem around you? Because I think the real data questions can only be answered not by one institution's data assets, but by bringing data together across an ecosystem. And that is, I think, where the conversation increasingly goes. And I think that is when this data is an asset, data is the new oil, where this becomes a bit of a double-edged sword. on one side, it's good that everybody realizes the value of data and the importance of good quality, curated, longitudinal data. On the other side, if everybody perceives I'm sitting on a treasure box and it's mine, and it may actually end up preventing sharing behaviors, because ultimately different players in an ecosystem need to come together on common data platforms or on integrated data platforms in order to get to bigger answers. And here often this can be a misunderstood, oh, data is the new oil, this is a big treasure. Then somebody sits on their small little data island and thinks like, oh, I want to see money. And it might not even be well structured, nor standardized, nor anything, but people are still holding on to it and hold it to their chest and are saying, I'm not going to share it with anybody. I'm sure I don't understand my data. I'm not on top of it. I'm not maintaining it, but I'm sure it's worth a fortune. And I think that is where professionalism and education comes into play. And I loved what you said, Caroline, about having first a conversation about the desired outcomes. What are the problems that we're solving for? And who is required to solve it and who will benefit? And then you can talk technology and data ownership and infrastructure, yada, yada, yada. You can talk later.
Well, listen, we've used up all of our time. Just want to say big thanks to the panel. Apologies to the people in the audience if we didn't get to your question. I think we touched on a lot of the themes in those questions. Any last words, Christian?
No, I really fully subscribe to what Susanne just said. Starting with the use case, what are we solving for, then working backwards.
Yeah. Caroline, thanks very much.
Yep, really good. Thank you.
And Susanne, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And
pleasure.
Thanks for everybody listening. Yeah, really great session. Thank you.
Ed, thanks
Thank
to
you
you too.
Have a good day.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.